Superfuel: Ketogenic Keys to Unlock the Secrets of Good Fats, Bad Fats, and Great Health by Dr. James Dino Colantonio and Dr. Joseph Mercola. Chapter 1: Historical Perspective: Demonizing the Wrong Fat. Throughout much of human history, people valued fat in their food. Today, hundreds of thousands of calories are available 24 hours a day at the nearest grocery store, and we can use our phones to order a bounty of food to be delivered right to our doorstep. But it wasn't always like that. Until very recently, wars, natural disasters, and other unforeseen events meant that people were never far away from a famine, or at the very least, a disruption to their normal diet. For this reason, fat, which provides more calories than protein or carbohydrates, was prized as an energy source. After all, that's what calories are: measurements of the amount of energy stored in food, and they used to be considered a good thing. It wasn't by happenstance that our ancestors waited until fall to slaughter the animals intended for food. They let them fatten up during summer and early autumn so there would be plenty of delicious and energy-rich fat when they were killed. And let's not forget that as recently as the 1940s, our grandmothers judged the quality of milk delivered in those quaint glass bottles by the thickness of the rich cream layer on top. How did we go from valuing fat as something to be savored and enjoyed, something that was necessary, to crowding supermarket shelves with low fat and fat-free products? The demonization of dietary fat in general and saturated fat in particular started in the mid-1950s. This is when a researcher named Ancel Keys published a study that seemed to indicate a positive association between the consumption of calories from fat and death from degenerative heart disease. In other words, the higher a population's dietary fat intake, the greater their rates of death from heart disease. This was a landmark known as the 6 Countries Study. Keys actually used data from 22 countries, and when data from the 16 countries Keys omitted in his study was incorporated, the association between fat and heart disease became much weaker. Not long after, a British researcher named John Yudkin, MD, would show that consumption of refined sugar tracks tightly with dietary fat. That is, populations with a high fat intake often also have a high sugar intake, indicating that sugar, not fat, could have been the cause of Keys' findings. Regardless of whether Keys or Yudkin had the stronger argument, these types of studies can never prove a causal effect between saturated fat and coronary heart disease, CHD, because they are observational in nature. In health and nutrition research, an observational epidemiological study is one in which researchers look at a population, make observations about what they eat, how they live, and their health outcomes, and then extrapolate those observations into general hypotheses about potential connections between the former and the latter. But until these hypotheses are proven through scientific experiments, they remain hypotheses, nothing more than educated guesses. As an example of observational epidemiology, people living in Mediterranean regions are often cited for their excellent health and long lives. This is typically attributed to the consumption of olive oil, or a diet rich in fresh vegetables, or even to moderate amounts of wine. But it could just as easily be due to infrastructure that requires much more walking than riding in cars, to the fresh air and beautiful scenery of the Mediterranean coast, to the sense of community and respect for elders in the region, or to some completely unknown factor. Epidemiology is great for generating hypotheses, but it is not reliable for determining which factors are responsible for the observed outcomes. After Key's 6-country study was published, another researcher, Edward Ahrens, became one of the best to show that when people swapped out animal fats in their diet in favor of highly processed industrialized plant oils, especially corn, safflower, or cottonseed oil, their cholesterol levels went down. Moreover, the fats that raised cholesterol levels the most were coconut oil and butterfat, which are both highly saturated fats. Aaron's findings provided plenty of ammunition for Keyes to implicate saturated fats as a cause of high cholesterol. Not long after, in 1961, a study was published indicating that elevated cholesterol was a key risk factor for CHD. This was one of the sparks that lit the fire that became known as the diet heart hypothesis. If high cholesterol levels were a major cause of heart disease, and if saturated fats increase cholesterol levels, saturated fats must therefore cause heart disease. And since polyunsaturated fats, mostly from vegetable and seed oils, were known to lower cholesterol levels, it was then assumed that they were heart healthy. Just because a saturated fat leads to B, higher cholesterol levels, and B is associated with C, CHD, that doesn't mean A causes C. Despite the clear flaws in this shaky hypothesis, in 1961, the American Heart Association officially recommended that Americans replace their intake of animal fat with vegetable oils. The diet heart hypothesis grew from a small fire to a towering inferno that blazed out of control. Even now, no matter how much water we pour over it, to see this for yourself, peruse the butter section of your local supermarket the next time you're there. The shelves are so crowded with margarine and vegetable oil spreads that it can be difficult to even find real butter. So what's the real cause of CHD? The real mechanism for how saturated fat increases cholesterol levels is still being debated, but it's thought to be caused by a reduction in low-density lipoprotein receptor activity in the liver. Low-density lipoprotein, LDL, is the form of cholesterol takes as it moves through your blood, and if there are fewer receptors for LDL or their activities decrease, then the LDL particles and the cholesterol they carry accumulate in the blood instead of being taken up by the liver. Polyunsaturated fats have the opposite effects on LDL receptor activity. They increase it, which lowers LDL in the blood. These are plausible mechanisms, but there's a problem. The increases in cholesterol levels from dietary saturated fat in animal studies occurred only when intake of omega-3 fats was low. In other words, a low omega-3 intake was the more likely factor contributing to high cholesterol, and not saturated fat intake per se. At the very least, this should have led to a slight refinement of the diet heart hypothesis. A low omega-3 intake leads to B, high cholesterol, which associates with C, CHD. But unfortunately, like so many other missed opportunities in the history of nutrition science, this didn't happen. Nuance and detail were ignored in favor of pithy sound bites. Early research by Keyes and Hegstead that implicated saturated fats as a cause of high cholesterol, called hypocholesterolemia, did not take into account background omega-3 intake. Deficiency in omega-3 fats likely contributes not only to hypercholesterolemia, but also to increased inflammation, abnormal blood clotting, and CHD. During the following decades, the diet heart hypotheses led to the demonization of milk, cheese, butter, pork, and beef, because the saturated fats in these foods could raise cholesterol levels. but not everyone believed that saturated fat was harmful. In fact, there is a cholesterol controversy among the scientific community that persists to this day, with many respected researchers and physicians declaring that neither saturated fat nor high cholesterol levels are harmful for the heart. Nonetheless, the first edition of the U.S. Dietary Goals, published in 1977, contained the federal government's first official recommendations that all Americans restrict their intake of saturated fat and increased intake of polyunsaturated fat up to 10% of total calories. Recommendations that have been upheld with each 5-year update of the dietary guidelines beginning in 1980. So, since 1977, Americans have been indoctrinated with the idea that polyunsaturated fats are helpful and strongly encouraged to avoid the demonized saturated fats. The theory was this would lower cholesterol levels and as a result reduce risk for heart disease. But as we now know, when omega-3 intake is low and omega-6 intake is high, as they typically are among the general U.S. population, lowering saturated fat intake results in increased synthesis of substances that promote inflammation and decrease synthesis of anti-inflammatory substances, which could ultimately lead to increased risk for heart disease, precisely the opposite of what this recommendation was intended to do. What we've looked at so far is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to weak nutritional science. And since official government recommendations on diet affect everything from hospital food to school lunches to what we see on store shelves and generally think of as healthy, let's dive into a bit more of the research and see if what we thought we knew about fat stands the test of time, or whether in fact it's time for a major update. Vegetable oils and omega-6, not as heart healthy as you thought. A very large long-term diet study called the Nurses' Health Study, NHS, found as much as a 32% reduction in CHD when subjects increased their intake of polyunsaturated fats. It was also estimated that replacing 5% of total calories from saturated fat, SFA, with polyunsaturated fats, PUFA, or carbohydrates would reduce the risk of CHD by 42% and 17%, respectively. A 42% potential reduction in heart disease risk is pretty great. So when these results were published, just about everybody was pretty convinced of the notion that omega-6 fat, which you mostly get in the form of linoleic acid, LA, from vegetable and seed oils was good for the heart. However, these findings once again were observational in nature, so they are unable to prove causation. Additionally, estimates of PUFA intake were based on dietary questionnaires which ask you to indicate how much of certain foods you consumed and how frequently you consumed them over some specific period of time. If you have a hard time remembering what you had for lunch 3 days ago, imagine trying to recall what you've eaten during the last 20 years, which was one of the follow-up points in the Nurses' Health Study. At best, these types of questionnaires generate extremely general ballparks of people's food consumption. At worst, they're entirely useless. Either way, they're a poor measure of what people actually eat, and they certainly cannot be considered ironclad evidence. Recommendations to replace saturated fats with omega-6 LA also came from studies showing that low LA and high SFA in the blood associated with increased risk for metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and inflammation. It's true that lower levels of LA in the blood are consistently associated with greater risk for CHD, death from CHD, and all-cause mortality. So these findings have been used to promote the idea that LA is good for the heart and to encourage increased consumption of vegetable oils. But what wasn't readily known at the time was that inflammation oxidizes LA, creating oxidized LA metabolites, thereby lowering LA levels in the blood. In fact, one of the studies looking at LA in the blood when the researchers adjusted for other relevant factors, low levels of LA were not strongly associated with an increased risk of death. This suggests that inflammation can cause low LA levels in the blood, and that the inflammation, rather than a low dietary intake of LA, drives the higher risk of CHD and death. Low levels of linoleic acid in the blood are likely a marker of increased inflammation in your body and don't necessarily reflect the amount of this fat in your diet. So if you have a low blood level of linoleic acid, it would be better for you to reduce the inflammation rather than consume omega-6 rich vegetable oils. The amount of certain fats you eat doesn't automatically correlate with the amount of those fats that end up in your bloodstream. The human body just isn't that simple. After all, if you eat a lot of spinach, your blood doesn't turn green. Compounds in the foods you eat go through an array of biochemical processes that significantly alter their structure and numbers before and even after they enter our blood. Mediterranean diets. The Mediterranean region has long been known for a low risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and depression. And the Mediterranean diet's fame goes back to that familiar figure, Ancel Keys, along with his epidemiological research from the 1950s and 60s. Keys looked at 16 areas in 7 countries and found that Mediterranean areas, Italy, Crete, Croatia, South Dalmatia, had lower rates of heart disease than the US and Northern Europe. Japan was also noted for a very low rate of heart disease. Based on this research, which was published as the 7-country study, Keys concluded that saturated fat was the major dietary villain. Left out of the study, however, was that the Mediterranean population, Keys said, it didn't consume large amounts of industrial seed oils. The trouble was, there wasn't just one Mediterranean diet pattern. Diets varied from country to country, and not all regions in which people lived long lives and had low rates of heart disease avoided meat or dairy. Think about France and Italy. They weren't exactly eating low-fat brie or fat-free prosciutto. While the 7-country study was used to further demonize saturated fat because of its role in raising cholesterol levels, omega-3 fat intake was not even addressed. Only saturated fat, monounsaturated, and totally polyunsaturated fat intakes were reported in dietary analyses. So the 7-country study could not say for sure whether the higher rates of heart disease in the US and Northern Europe were being driven by these populations consuming more saturated fat or less omega-3. Had omega-3 intake been measured, we might be blaming a low omega-3 intake and not saturated fat for the scourge of heart disease. Researchers swept all this nuance under the rug, and saturated fat alone received the blame for the difference in health and between Mediterranean countries and regions with higher rates of coronary heart disease. If this were a trial accusing saturated fat of crimes against heart health, any intelligent jury would have laughed this evidence right out of the courtroom. Other research on dietary fat. The Mediterranean diet is just one of many eating patterns that has been studied in hopes of identifying individual factors that either help or harm health in general, and cardiovascular health in particular. Unfortunately, the weaknesses that plague the research on the Mediterranean way of eating aren't unique to that region, and Ancel Keys wasn't the only scientist who jumped to false conclusions that eventually became the dietary laws of the land. Let's take a look at findings from other countries and see if they support the diet heart hypothesis, or if they have more holes than a piece of Swiss cheese. Earlier, it was noted that Japan was recognized for having a low rate of heart disease, but it wasn't just low. In the late 1960s, Japan was ranked lowest for deaths from coronary heart disease and lowest for consumption of saturated fat. Seems like a slam dunk then, right? The lowest intake of saturated fat and the lowest rate of CHD deaths. Remember, this is only an association. Just because these two things occur together doesn't automatically mean that one causes the other. Along with their low saturated fat intake, the Japanese also had a very low intake of omega-6 fats and a high intake of omega-3. But when Japanese people immigrated to Hawaii, their risk of CHD increased. He's blamed this on an increase in their saturated fat intake, but it just as well could have been due to reduction in the omega-3s the Japanese were accustomed to eating in their seafood-rich diet. A number of other epidemiological studies found associations between higher cholesterol levels and increased risk for CHD, but many other studies did not find this association. Despite this inconsistency, the ones that did find an association were used as further ammunition supporting the idea that saturated fat was dietary enemy number one. In nutritional science, this is known as cherry picking. It's a dangerous practice in which researchers focus on the studies and data that support their hypotheses while downplaying or altogether ignoring the ones that don't. Research on dietary fat is rife with cherry picking, which is one reason why there are so many conflicting headlines about diet these days. Cholesterol confusion. Years later, when a large number of studies had been published, researcher Peter Parati concluded that the epidemiological studies, the ones that can only create hypotheses and not establish cause and effect, did not support a role for saturated fat in causing heart disease. In fact, Parati noted that while saturated fats increase LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, they also increase HDL, the good cholesterol, even more if the saturated fat is coconut oil. Additionally, saturated fats had another potential benefit. They decrease small, dense LDL particles in another type of lipid called lipoprotein A, both of which are now believed to be better indicators of cardiovascular risk than total cholesterol or LDL. Based on a broader view of the blood lipid changes that occur when varying intakes of saturated fat, it was shown that indicators of heart health may actually improve with a greater saturated fat intake, especially if that saturated fat replaces sugar and other refined carbohydrates. Remember that saturated fat is an umbrella term for a mixture of a group of different individual fats, each with its own unique properties. Some of their properties result from the number of carbon atoms in the fats. For example, with regard to raising total cholesterol and LDL levels, lauric acid, 12 carbons, is more potent than myristic acid, 14 carbons, and substantially more potent than stearic acid, 16 carbons. What is conveniently ignored is the intriguing fact that lauric acid also increases HDL the most. Most of the raising effect of lauric acid on total cholesterol comes because it typically raises HDL, which is why an increased intake of saturated fat can actually result in a decreased ratio of total cholesterol to HDL. And this ratio is a much more powerful predictor of CHD risk than LDL. Talk about an inconvenient truth. Another inconvenient point is that the famous Framingham study, very long-term epidemiological study of a population in Framingham, Massachusetts, showed that low intakes of saturated fat and cholesterol were associated with an increase in small dense LDL particles, which again are a more powerful heart disease risk factor than LDL as a whole. You're probably accustomed to seeing LDL on a lab printout from your doctor, but there isn't just one kind of LDL. There are several subtypes, each with its own characteristics and effects, kind of like how there are several different types of saturated fat. At the same time, other studies showed that a higher saturated fat intake is associated with an increase in large buoyant LDL particles and a decrease in small dense particles. This is key because a preponderance of small dense LDL particles, referred to as pattern B, is believed to be more likely to be harmful for cardiovascular health than a preponderance of large buoyant particles, pattern A. The reason for this is that small dense LDL particles can penetrate artery walls more easily than the large buoyant particles.